Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be making this green gingham dress inspired by several designs of 1940 sewing patterns that I saw online. This was my initial concept drawing. As you can see, I drew pretty heavily from the designs that I have on the screen right now, and I decided to put patch pockets that were pretty popular in the 1940s, and as you can see, the patch pockets mimic the shape of the yoke. So I started by drafting my pattern for my basic block, which is basically a pattern that fits my body perfectly, and I use it to then draft other patterns from that pattern. Sorry the footage is so dark, by the way. I promise it does get better later on. But as you can see, this is the bodice piece, and I have these yoke pieces that attach together and then attach to the bodice. And I added some extra room to the bodice so it can gather up under the yoke, and it is cut on the fold along the center front. The back is pretty basic. I decided not to add gathering to that, and so it's basically just my block with yoke pieces cut out of it, just like the front. That's the majority of the interesting pattern drafting. The sleeves are also puff sleeves with cuffs that gather it closer to the arm, and the skirt is just a basic gathered skirt, and I cut out the waistband and the pockets later on. I tend to not make pattern pieces for waistbands and patch pockets because most of the time I just end up freehanding them later in the project, so you'll see me cut them out later. I started by pinning my pattern to this green cotton gingham. This fabric is slightly lighter than a quilting cotton, and I got it from Joann Fabrics. I think I got 1.5 yards or 2 yards for this project, I forgot which, and it ended up being plenty. I draft all of my self-drafted patterns net, which means I don't include seam allowance, and that just makes it easier in the pattern drafting process to kind of imagine how everything fits together. On projects where precision is needed, a lot of the time I go in with a fabric pen or a pencil and I mark exactly where the seam lines are so that I'm able to be a bit more precise in sewing and pinning. But this project, since it's just a basic dress, I didn't think that was necessary, so I just went around and eyeballed the seam allowance. Here you can see the sleeve piece I was talking about. As you can see, I extended it quite a bit from the original. You can kind of see where I cut the pattern and added extra room in between the original pattern piece. Here I'm just cutting a big rectangle of fabric for the skirt, and I'm just following the lines of the gingham so that I get a straight line. I love working with striped fabrics and stuff that you're able to do that with. Next, I marked the darts on the back. On all of my pattern pieces, I use this it's kind of like an awl tool that came with my sewing machine to poke little holes wherever I want to indicate a spot, basically like a perforation on a commercial sewing pattern. And so I marked all of the dart points in that way, and I'm just using my fabric pen to transfer those onto the fabric so I could draw in my darts. This is a disappearing ink pen, so after some time, or if it's exposed to moisture, the ink just completely disappears, which is really nice. And I'm also pinning the darts on the back in preparation for sewing. This is the front piece, and as you can see, is going to be gathered along the top and bottom edges. And also this is a demonstration of how the yoke pieces will form together. As you can see, there's like 2 pieces on the front and back, and they just all seam together. Here I'm sewing the darts on the back. And I'm also adding machine gathering along the top and bottom edge of the front piece. How I like to do this is I increase my machine stitch length to something a bit larger than what I usually stitch with, and then I sew 2 lines of gathering threads. You'll see when I actually gather the fabric, but that makes sure that all of the gathers are neatly and nicely aligned, and the increased stitch length just makes it easier to gather. When I get to the end of my row of gathering threads, I turn the presser foot, stitch 1 stitch, and start going back the other way so that the stitches for the gathering are aligned, and that makes the gathering sit smoothly when you actually go to pull it. And while I was at it, I also gathered the sleeve caps and the bottom of the sleeves, but we won't be working on those for quite some time. Next, I decided to work on the yoke. So I cut 4 layers of each piece because obviously it's mirrored on the right and left side of the dress, just like how most pattern pieces are, but I also cut an extra layer to kind of act as a facing to the yoke. Basically, it's just going to be like a double layered yoke that we're going to apply to the top of the dress. Just like logically speaking, this was the easiest way I could think of to do a yoke like this, and it worked out pretty well. So first I stitched all of the seams on the top layer of the yoke, and then I'll stitch all of that to the underside layer, kind of like a facing. The only thing is, I think I got the angle of the shoulder seam a little bit off, and so the dress just feels like it fits weirdly on the shoulders, but you can't really tell when you look at it. It just kind of feels like it's slightly off the shoulder, even though when you just look at it, it doesn't look like that at all. Since I took this straight from my block pattern, that's definitely just like an inaccuracy. I never noticed in it. And it just happened to come out in this pattern because the shoulder was kind of split into two parts, the bodice and the yoke. So I'll have to go and fix that at some point. After pressing open the yoke seams, I then stitched the underside of the yoke to the outside of the yoke, and then I can turn that to the inside like a facing of a neckline. I also decided the yoke was a little bit too wide, and so I'm just stitching closer in from the seam allowance to just widen the neckline. Then I went around and clipped all of my corners so that when I turn the piece inside out, they all sit smoothly, and I also trimmed down my seam allowance just to eliminate some bulk. At this point, I also quickly sewed the shoulder seams of the bodice. Then, while I was at my machine, I understitched the yoke, which is basically a technique where you stitch the seam allowance to one of the layers of fabric, and it basically just makes everything sit smoother because one of the layers of fabric is kind of encouraged to curl inwards because it's tacked to the seam allowance, and the other layer of fabric just sits more smoothly over the top. And I just did that along the entire yoke, just like how I would finish a neckline. At this point, I was ready to stitch the yoke onto the bodice, and so I gathered the top edge of the bodice, and it's also gathered quite tightly as a design detail, and so once I compressed it to the correct length, I just used my machine to sew over that line to just keep it all in place. And then I could sew my yoke to the bodice, just going around the top edge. The dress is also open along the center back so that I can put in a zipper there later. My block pattern kind of mimics the 1940s silhouette because that's what I mostly enjoy making, but that means the shoulder seam ends and the sleeve begins kind of at the exact end of the shoulder, and that's really good for 1940s blouses that kind of hang directly off of the shoulder, but for a more puff sleeve design like this, I figured I'd better shorten the armscye a little bit when I still had the chance. Then I cut strips of fabric for the waistband and the sleeve cuffs. For my waistbands, I usually just cut the fabric 1.5 to 2 inches longer than my actual waist so that I have a bit of room for seam allowance, a bit of room for ease, and then I could just trim off what I don't need on top of that. This is one of the sleeve pieces, and I'm just gathering the lower edge, then pinning the cuff piece to this and stitching it. I didn't film it, but I turned the cuff piece to the inside, kind of like folded it in half, and hand stitched it to the inside of the sleeve. Then, since I haven't sewn the side seams of the bodice yet, I was able to set my sleeves flat, which is something I really enjoy doing. I just find it a lot easier to set them in this way, and then you're able to just sew the sleeve seam and the side seam all in one go, just straight down. And that's what I did next. As you can see, I'm starting from the waistline of the bodice. This is the back piece right here, and then I'm just going up the side of the bodice to the underarm and continuing to the sleeve cuff. Next, I sewed the waistband. I decided the easiest way to do this was to sew the waistband into a tube first, just so that it's double layered and a bit more structured, and then I turned it inside out with a great amount of difficulty off camera, I remember. Then I could just pin that to the bodice. This is the back of the bodice right here. And of course also to the front of the bodice. And before I stitched that in place, I also pinned it to the skirt. But before I could pin it to the skirt, I had to gather the skirt, which was much the same as gathering on the rest of the garment. And I figured the easiest way to do this was to just top stitch it all together along the waistband. I actually made this dress back at the end of the summer, and right now, as I'm doing this voiceover, it is January 26th of 2024, and I've just been so busy I never got around to editing it. And lastly, along the center back seam, above where I'd already stitched the bottom of the skirt together, I added a zipper that extended all the way up to the neckline. Back in like 2021 or something, I bought a 3-pack of yellow zippers, and like 3 years later, I still have some of them, and so I just started sewing them into random garments that don't actually match the yellow zipper, and I like never make yellow things, so I have to use them somehow. And the very last thing I did was stitch down the inside of the yoke, just like how you would whip stitch a facing into place. I decided to use the cat stitch because if you read like 1940s sewing manuals or look at the instructions from commercial sewing patterns at the time, the cat stitch is a really common finishing stitch. And you can also see how my understitching is kind of holding the facing to the inside of the garment and preventing it from showing on the outside of the garment. I feel like I talked about the quote-unquote last thing I did like 3 times, but the actual final last step was sewing the hem along the bottom edge. Since it was just a straight rectangle of fabric, I could just turn up the edge and stitch, which is definitely a lot easier than finishing circle skirts or gourd skirts. Oh my god, I keep on forgetting things I did in this dress. The actual last thing I did was make and stitch on patch pockets. I didn't film the making of them, but as you can see, the top of the pocket is kind of just like a facing piece that I made similarly to the yoke. I just cut out 2 layers of this U-shaped piece and I stitched along the edge and I clipped my corners and just turned it inside out, and the bottom is just a rectangle of fabric that I stitched to that. I turned in all of the raw edges along the outside and stitched that to the dress. And here's how it came out. At the time, I wasn't super happy with it. I think because I didn't think it looked very 1940s and it was a bit more cottagecore and modern than what I usually like to make, but looking back on it, I still think it's a pretty dress. As I mentioned before, the shoulders are a little bit uncomfortable. I'd have to mess around with my block pattern to find out what caused that and why it hasn't been a problem on any of my other garments. I did, however, recently make a custom dress form, and I think that's going to be really helpful in the future for pattern drafting and also fitting. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're new here and interested in vintage fashion and sewing, feel free to subscribe. Also, if you like vintage knitting, the link to my Etsy store where I sell some vintage knitting and crochet patterns is also in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
If I'm dreaming, don't wait.